Correct. So for small business, we think those are certainly very positive measures. So for small business, those deductions for upskilling, for training, for investment in digital technology, that's a very positive thing. And it goes along with the measures to improve cash flow and also to reduce the impact of compliance, introducing some smart deregulatory measures there. So I think on balance for small business there are certainly some positive elements in the budget.
Great. Can we just get a name and title quickly?
So it's Andrew Michele from the Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The test for the government tonight going into the budget was whether they would end nearly a decade of low wage growth for Australian workers. And the answer tonight is no. Nothing in this budget delivers real wage increases for working people. One-off payments are not the same as wage increases. And what this budget confirms is that workers lost $800 on average in real wage cuts in 2021, and they are now going to lose, based on the government's own figures, $500 in wage cuts in real terms in the first 6 months of this year. That's workers' wages going backwards under the Morrison government. They had an opportunity tonight. They had an opportunity to address doing something about working people's wages. And tonight they've completely failed to do that. There's not one-off increases in rising cost of rent. There's not one-off increases in rising costs of childcare or groceries. But all we have is one-off payments that will be quickly eaten up. And meanwhile, working people are left without the wage increases they need.
Any questions?
And I guess, what sort of reforms are you looking for, would you be looking for from this government or the next government, whichever party wins the next election?
So what the government could have done and what's needed to drive real wage increases in our economy is support for a lift in the minimum wage. This Friday, the minimum wage case begins. The federal government could support a significant increase in the minimum wage that would flow on to 1 in 4 Australian workers. The other thing they could do that could have been delivered in tonight's budget is a wage increase for their own workforce. So public sector employees, there's no removal of the wage cap. They continue to lose and go backwards in real terms under this government. And of course, look at aged care. No money to address the recommendations of the Royal Commission, one of which was about the important need to lift wages to make sure that you have quality jobs in this sector to deliver that quality care for older Australians. There's nothing in this budget that supports that important case or the payment to deliver wage increases in aged care. These things are tangible things that could have been done by this government, and they've completely walked away from working Australians.
What about the argument from the government that the drop in the unemployment rate will see employers competing for workers, and so that should drive up wages?
So this is already a theory that's been disproven. What we now see is a break between what used to be a connection between the unemployment rate and people's wages. And that's because we have so many more people now in insecure work. We have more Australians now having to work 2, 3 or 4 jobs just to get by than we have ever had in our history. And since 2020, nearly half of the jobs that have been created by this government have been insecure ones. So many people are in jobs, they don't know how much they're going to earn week to week or month to month. They don't have a reliable wage, and that link between the unemployment figures and wage increases no longer works in the Australian economy or in the labour market. The other thing to say is that unemployment figures hide what else is going on for working people. So there's many workers that are still looking for more hours of work. there's 130,000 women who, because of childcare responsibilities in 2021, were unable to even look for the work that they wanted to have because they had childcare responsibilities without any support or affordable childcare. Again, tonight in this budget, there is nothing that delivers accessible, affordable childcare for working Australians. There's nothing that improves for women their access to childcare and consequently their ability to work more hours and get the jobs they're looking for.
What about changes to paid parental leave, extending the eligibility for the first time, allowing single parents access to the full 20 weeks?
Well, the real changes that were needed for paid parental leave was firstly to pay it above the minimum wage. So it continues to only be paid on the minimum wage. And what that will mean, despite the government now saying that it could be either parent that can share the leave, there's no extra leave, it's just putting what used to be 18 weeks for the primary carer with the 2 weeks for the partner together to make 20. So no extra leave there at all, but still on the minimum wage. So in fact, that's a disincentive because the majority of women are on lower wages than men. So it doesn't fix the problem, even though it looks like on the surface it's saying it'll mean more men will participate in having paid leave. Because of the low rate of the pay, that's actually unlikely to come about. And when you look around the world, the best paid parental leave schemes pay it at their higher rate, and they have an incentive for men to share in the care of children. There's no incentive in this at all.
Can I just get a quick name and title just so I don't lose it?
It's Michele O'Neill, and I'm the president of the ACTU, and it's Michele and O'Neill both with one L.
Perfect, thanks so much.
All good? Thanks, everybody.
Goldie, and I'm Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council of Social Service, representing the interests of people on the lowest incomes in the country, looking to end poverty and disadvantage. Well, this is a budget tonight that people can't rely on. We needed permanent solutions. We got temporary fixes. We as a country, as a community, know that we face big challenges. We know that we face climate change. The floods are happening right now. The community wanted to see us invest and go to a concrete plan to tackle that. Right now, we've got people who are facing homelessness and hunger, and we didn't get a budget that will tackle in a permanent way what we need to really be serious about tackling the cost of living for people who are struggling the most. There's nothing in this budget that will lift up the incomes of people who have the least. We don't have anything to get people beyond $46 per day if you're a person who's unemployed. Whilst we welcome that we've got that $250 one-off payment being extended both to people who are on pensions and also people who are on allowances. If you're living on just $46 a day, that $250, it might help you for a week, it might just help you for 2, but you've got to pay your rent every single week, 52 weeks of the year. And if you live out there in renting land, you know that rental prices almost everywhere have gone through the roof, and in some parts of regional Australia, rents have gone up by almost 30% since the beginning of this pandemic. I mean, if this was a budget that was going to be serious about the cost of living, it would have tackled the biggest cost of living, which is housing affordability. The 2 measures that the government has extended, which it purports to put out there to you to promise it'll help you to tackle housing affordability, the only thing that those first homeowner schemes and those super savings schemes will do is push up the price of the housing market. How many people have you spoken to who said, in almost a week, I thought I had just enough to buy a home, and it disappears overnight because these are the kinds of policies that this government has been delivering budget after budget, and what they're doing is fueling upward pressure on housing prices. If this was a budget that was serious about housing affordability, it would have built social housing, low-income housing, to help people who absolutely are desperate to just keep a roof over their head, people who are tonight worried about whether they're going to be evicted tomorrow because they cannot afford to pay the rent. Nothing in this budget to deliver any kind of relief for them. I'm very aware, as you are, that we have a series of big challenges. The disaster challenge is real. The pandemic is not gone. Yet in this budget, the government seems to want to pretend that these challenges are not going to get any worse. We don't have anything to fix the adequacy of the disaster recovery payment. That's a payment that's been set at $1,000 per person for 15 years. Now, you'll recall that the government moved under pressure to increase the payment finally to $3,000 per person, as ACOSS had been calling for years, but nothing in this budget to deliver a permanent increase to the disaster recovery payment, so that people who are facing the devastation of these disasters right now that know that they may get a little bit more. And in these budget papers tonight, if you're worried about the pandemic, you are probably worried right now that you might be getting COVID. Well, the government seems to be planning to remove the pandemic leave disaster payment. Now, that was the last payment there to help you if you're a low-paid casual worker, if you got COVID and you had no access to leave. Well, it appears tonight the government's decided that you don't need help if you've got COVID. You will, in the end, the reality is we've got an income support system that has not been increased. We don't have a permanent solution to end poverty. We don't have any kind of permanent solutions to deal with housing affordability. And we certainly don't have a plan in this budget to tackle the disaster crisis and the ongoing issues associated with the pandemic. Look, there are some welcome measures in here. The PPL scheme is something where we would have wanted to see that made available to both parents, and to have the full 20 weeks made available to single parents. That was overdue to do that. But we don't have any extension of the number of weeks, nor do we have any increase in the payment level beyond the minimum wage. And I think for everybody out there who's been experiencing the last 2 years, you don't get more serious than being able to afford access to childcare. We were certainly hoping in this budget we'd see a government that didn't deliver more tax cuts, but instead invested in the caring services that we know have done the heavy lifting over the course of this pandemic. You know, in 2020, for a moment the country got a taste of what it would be like to end poverty and make sure that we actually guaranteed essential services. When we lifted up the adequacy of JobSeeker, we gave help to people who needed the help the most, and they spent it in the real economy, and they helped to keep other people in jobs. And we made childcare accessible and affordable for people. That's not what this budget is delivering tonight. As I say, we've got temporary fixes, not permanent solutions. The country knows, the community knows, that we have to deliver the big changes. We can afford to do it. Of course, the biggest spend in this budget is more tax cuts. The biggest spend baked into this budget are $30 billion in tax cuts. That stage 3 tax cuts, they're all still there. Let's remember, $16 billion in 2024 will be going mostly to higher income people, mostly men. At the same time, the government could just find $1.3 billion over 6 years to deal with violence against women.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Bandt, here are the Greens and Dorinda Cox, our mining and resources spokesperson. We needed a budget that tackles the climate crisis, the inequality and the housing crisis. This budget funds more coal and gas, locks in tax cuts for the very wealthy, and makes housing more expensive. There's over $38 billion in handouts to coal, oil and gas corporations, but no new money for renewable energy. There's $13 billion in handouts to the very wealthy to push up housing prices, but no new money for affordable housing. And people on low to middle income earners might get a one-off $420 payment, but billionaires get $9,000 a year forever. This budget might deliver short one-off payments for some people on income support, but it will still leave people in poverty. So people who are looking for work will remain in poverty after this budget. And as for the pension, we need an increase to the pension of about $250 a fortnight, not $250 an election. By locking in the tax cuts that rip over $180 billion out of the budget, out of the budget over the next decade, this budget makes Australia a more unequal place. This budget will not keep you safe from the climate crisis and will not put an affordable roof over your head. This budget is based on wages having gone backwards and continuing to go backwards for some time before miraculously, supposedly rising in future years. The government's never got a wage rise prediction in its budget right before, and there's no reason to expect they're going to start getting one now. Any questions? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Ian Yates, Council on the Ageing Australia. Look, millions of older Australians will benefit from the cost of living relief tonight, including a very large number, of course, of age pensioners who will benefit from the $250. They've just had a significant indexation increase in the pension, but that adjusts for costs that have already gone past. Clearly, we are in supermarkets and petrol houses facing significant price increases that $250 will help with, as indeed will the 22 cents a litre in petrol, particularly for older Australians living in regional and rural areas where they need to get in a car to see a doctor or visit the hospital or other essential services. So those are all welcome, as indeed is the $420 tax rebate that will help many low and middle income older Australians apart from pensioners. So those things are welcome. We are a little surprised that the government, as part of its economic stimulus package, and indeed lifting workforce participation amongst mature age people, hasn't relaxed, at least for a period, the income test for pensioners to encourage more of them back into the workforce in the current tight market. Been a lot of chatter about that, and we're surprised it didn't happen. In aged care, obviously tonight doesn't rate alongside last year's $17.7 billion package. However, there is some $463 billion in total additional in a range of measures, some topping up measures in last year's package, some extending them, like the pharmacy in residential care scheme. A very important initiative tonight was the putting of a price on the new residential care funding, the Australian National Aged Care Classification System, which starts on the 1st of October. And on a like-for-like basis, that will lift funding per bed per day from about $186 to about $216, and you see that reflected in the forwards that, for example, in the first full year, residential care funding will be about 18 billion compared to 15 billion this year. So that's important. One of the things that we, as the consumer representatives, will be saying is government needs to apply even greater transparency to that. It needs to get how providers are spending that money accounted for in detail. Australians who are paying for this, for a person's bed, on an average it'll be about $225 a day, need to know how providers are spending that taxpayers' money. There is greater transparency in the reform package, but we want even more of it. The other thing that we are probably, again, disappointed, as we have been for a good many years now, but it was a recommendation of the Royal Commission, as well as many other inquiries, is the absence of a oral and dental health program aimed at older Australians. And we look with optimism to both sides of politics for an announcement on that over the coming weeks.
What about the $340 million in the budget to embed pharmacies within aged care facilities? Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I mentioned that in passing. Yeah, that is a good idea. That initiative was announced earlier this week. That's one of the additions to the 17.7, and then the extra that was in MyFO that brought it to 18.3. We're now talking 18.8 billion in that package. Yes, that's an important initiative. It took a while to work through how to do it, but it's an important initiative. There are still others in the Royal Commission's kit bag, if you like. We obviously are all concerned about workforce in aged care. Not surprisingly, the budget doesn't contain any extra provision, but when the Fair Work Commission hands down its increase in hopefully just a couple of months' time in this year, we anticipate that whoever is in government will be paying that, and that's a really essential part of lifting aged care.
And you mentioned the work for the pension requirement. Given that business groups have been standing here saying that the increase in the net migration isn't enough because we still don't have enough staff, is it particularly frustrating that you've been putting forward a solution to some of those staffing woes and it seems to have been ignored?
Look, to be very fair, no one knows what the elasticity is there, how many people might come. We certainly thought it was worth a try, but I would also say that we are aware that government is, as we speak, working on a targeted migration program for aged care workforce, or for the broader care workforce. There's no point doing it just for aged care because then NDIS pinches aged care and the health system pinches from both of them. So we need now that the borders are open, a stepped up migration program for that, as well as a long-term skills development program and culture change in the industry, really, significant change, because the reason people don't work in aged care certainly is wages, but not just wages. It depends on what kind of provider you have and whether you get to actually be the instrumental person in that older person's life, or you're just following a provider's set of rules. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.
Evening. Claerwen, National Director, UnitingCare Australia. I'll start with a positive. Tonight we'll welcome the $1.3 billion package for women's safety. Women's safety, we know in this country, is still one of our wicked problems, and we need to solve that as fast as we possibly can. So we do welcome that tonight, and we welcome the extension of the escaping violence payment. We also welcome and acknowledge the one-off payments for those in our community who are really feeling the squeeze of the cost of living. But we do believe that a structural problem, such as stagnant wages, needs a structural solution. In our pre-budget submission, we called for three things. The first being a productivity commission or a national inquiry into stagnant incomes, which also included income support, accelerated and done and dusted by Christmas so that it would give us, the policymakers and the community, some solutions to this incredibly difficult problem we've been dealing with for 10 years. Secondly, superannuation on the paid parental leave scheme. Disappointed we didn't see that in the budget tonight. It's been a lot of talk about that, and we'll be pushing for that in the election period. We believe that will at least go some way. For a $250 million payment, it's not a lot. It could have gone some way to help us to bridge the 42% gender gap in superannuation. And thirdly, aged care wages. Many people have talked about that tonight, and it remains an absolute disgrace that we pay our aged care workers just $21 an hour. We believe they do one of the most important jobs that anyone can do in our community to look after our elders. And we really need to make sure that when that Fair Work Commission comes, A, the decision is adequate for those workers, and B, that money is stumped up by whoever's in government at the time. So we'll be taking those into the election period, but tonight's budget, a few welcomes, but many things that we're looking for the future. Thank you.
Go to the mics, please. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Georgie Beatty and I'm the President of the National Union of Students. This budget was not for students. This budget was about getting Scott Morrison re-elected. A one-off $250 payment is not going to make up for a decade of neglect. It's not even going to make next week's rent. If Scott Morrison really wanted to help students, he would have lowered the age of independence from 22 to 18 so that students could get into university regardless of their parents' wealth or postcode, but based on the effort that they put in high school. And he would have raised Centrelink payments to above the Henderson poverty line. If students want better outcomes now, they need to vote in a different government. Thank you. I'll be around for questions.
Will that 22 cents a litre cut to the fuel excise make much of a difference to students?
Look, it is going to make an exceptional difference, especially to regional students. We have students that regularly will go 2 hours, a 2-hour drive to get a basic education, to get their university degree. It's not uncommon, and you know, having that decrease to fuel will help, but the question is, what happens in 6 months when that ends? Because it's still going to hurt students, and we know that it's still going to be an issue in 6 months. And look, at the end of the day, students are hurting. We welcome this temporary relief, but we know that it's going to need much more than that, and it's going to need permanent increases, not band-aid solutions.
Thank you. Thanks.
Evening, Richie Merzien, Climate Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute. The fuel excise cut is bad economic management. Hold on.
It'll be a while. It's okay.
Yeah, okay.
We can talk to him.
All right. The fuel excise cut is bad economic management, it's bad economic policy, and it's bad policy full stop. Over the last 9 years, the government has left Australians hooked on foreign oil and done nothing to wean it off. Nothing on fuel efficiency standards, nothing on electrifying our cars, and very little on public and active transport. The fuel excise cut will be weaned away and wiped out within a few months at the current climbing rates of oil price increases. And that's if it's fully passed on to the Bowser. It doesn't matter what the problem is for this government, the solution is always more money for gas. Gas fracking in the NT, gas-based hydrogen, and nothing for electric vehicles, which is the long-term solution to drive us out of the current fuel crisis. Any questions?
Omar Khorshid from the AMA. Today's budget, like every budget before it, claims record spending on healthcare. But of course, if you scratch the surface, it's very easy to see the lack of vision for Australia's healthcare and the lack of any intent to address the major issues that are affecting our healthcare system right now, and of course that we know are going to be increasing problems into the future. The AMA had 4 main asks of the government this budget round, and unfortunately none of these have been delivered. On public hospitals, where we see extraordinary levels of ambulance ramping, people stuck in emergency departments who can't get into the hospital, a hospital system that is completely jammed up, there is nothing there to solve that problem. There is no solution for the blame game that still exists between our Commonwealth and state governments on public hospital outcomes and public hospital services. In primary care, thankfully there is finally acknowledgement of the 10-year primary healthcare plan, the government's own 10-year primary healthcare plan, but there's no funding to deliver that. And yet again, general practitioners tonight will be feeling let down by a government that doesn't have any vision for healthcare. We asked for some attention to be paid to our private health insurance product, a product that is key to Australians' quality of life, cost of living, because of course premiums have been going up and up and up over many years. And although premium rises this year are lower, that's simply because of the pandemic and absolutely nothing to do with the government's actions in fixing the affordability of our private health insurance product. Yet again, no plan for the future. And of course the AMA is always pushing for prevention to be on the agenda. We've made the very simple and well-supported idea of a sugar-sweetened beverage tax, and of course there's no sign of that anywhere in the budget. So as we go forward into an election campaign, knowing of course this is purely an election budget, a very generous election budget, we need to see vision from both our major parties on what they are going to do for healthcare. At the moment, that is sadly lacking, and we're really looking forward to hearing what Labor's view is for health going forward. And of course, the AMO will continue to push government to come up with solutions for these problems that are affecting the lives of thousands of Australians every single day. Any questions?
You talked about the state-federal split between hospital funding. Like, this is an issue that a number of states have spoken about for months and years through the pandemic. How important is it that Labor outlines some plans around this before the election?
It's critical that funding for public hospitals is raised. Now, our suggestion is that go to 50-50, with the Commonwealth lifting its proportion from 45% to 50%. That'd be $20 billion extra over 4 years for public hospitals. And it's something that Labor has in the past had in their policy platform, but we've not heard anything from them as yet as to what their plan is for public hospitals. So seeing now that the government has missed this opportunity to address public hospital funding, we're very interested to talk to Labor and hear what their vision will be to address our public hospital funding crisis.
Come forward to the mics, please.
Yes, Carolyn Smith, United Workers Union Aged Care Director, and I've got a group of aged care workers with me. They'll introduce themselves as they come up to the mic, but they work in both residential and home care. This is a budget from a government who seems to have forgotten that 900 people have died in aged care over the last 12 months. This is a budget that has nothing in it for extra staff. This is a budget that has nothing in it for wages for workers, to keep workers in the sector so they can provide quality care. This is a budget that doesn't provide for extra home care packages. What we are going to see from this budget is, yet again, older Australians being let down, older Australians struggling to receive the quality care that they deserve in residential and home care, aged care. We're really disappointed that the only extra money we see tonight is money for training. What is the use for money for training for new aged care workers when we know workers are leaving the sector in record numbers because of the understaffing and the low wages in aged care?
Hi, I'm Curtis. I've been in the aged care industry for 18 years. In those 18 years, nothing's changed. It's progressively got worse. Residents are not getting the care they need. They're crying when you're trying to say, sorry, I don't have time to sit with you. I can't have a cup of tea with you. I've got to help this other person. This budget does nothing to solve any of the problems that are in aged care and have been there for all this time. Now we need to take action.
Hi, I'm Marina. I work in aged care and I've been there for 4 years. Mr. Morrison and Mr. Frydenberg, they've disappointed us again. They're failures. And when I go back and I've got to tell my colleagues that we've got nothing, absolutely nothing. We're the pariahs of this world. No one takes us seriously. No one respects us. We asked for a decent wage so we could also have the dignity to go back to our families, to be treated like people, not like animals. But that's what we are being treated as. We are the low caste. Didn't get a mention. So he's going to throw money at training. He might as well train monkeys because no one wants to come into the aged care. They're all running away. I'm disappointed, and I would like to see what the opposition leader has in store for us, because mark my words, I'll be back to let him know where he can shove it to.
Hi, I'm Shin from Queensland. I'm a personal carer in aged care facility as well. I've been working for 2 years now. Also, I've been through the pandemic. I was working on the very first line on the floor. And what I can tell you is, can you imagine, I had one morning shift, only got 2 personal carers to looking after 30 residents. It's horrible for me. I was actually called back to help because before that I was already dropped quite a few shifts. I don't want to do anymore. And it's really, I have a heart of caring, and when my reception called me to help, because we're really running shortage of hands on the floor. So I accept and I went back to help, but that's what I had. And I think I'm not going to have that shift anymore. No. And yeah, so we, you know, it's understaffing issue is even worse during the pandemic. And residents in the room, they're not well explained by management level. And carers did quite most of the job to deliver care, but also explanation, because quite a lot of people, they're in isolation, they couldn't go out of the room. And that time we had, on the wing, we are looking after, got 5 positive cases on there. And management was very reluctant to do the test because we didn't have enough storage for rat tests or, yeah. And we were required to tell reasonable reason to get tests done. And it's insulting. I had a colleague who had only, that day she told me she had an 8-month baby at home to look after, and she was a bit scared to stand up by herself to say that I want to test myself before I go home after the shifts with closely contact with all the positive cases. And one of the managers was saying, "Oh, what about me?" I was like, "Nah, I'm not gonna give you any reasons to just get tests done for us." So this is my story.
Hi, my name's Teresa. I'm from Newcastle and I've been a home care worker for the last 20 years. We were already in crisis before COVID hit. There were 2 royal commissions that, if you'd like to look carefully under some rock that have been hidden away, we can dig them out and try and work on the findings. Under COVID, things for home care workers are substantially worse. Morrison has offered us 22 cents a litre fuel excise. My fuel allowance is 72 cents and petrol is $2. I can work anywhere from 2 hours a day or even 1 hour a day over the course of a full day, not even consecutively. That 22 cents is not going to do anything for me. Home care workers face huge uncertainty in their hours. Our work is grossly insecure. Under COVID, it disappeared almost completely. We could no longer take clients out to their social outings. We couldn't take them shopping. We started actually creating little mini markets in the back of our cars. Our employers didn't encourage that or help to pay for it. We did that off our own bat. That's something that care workers do, not governments or anybody with any sense of responsibility. We need help. We need help right now. The sector is not just failing, it has failed. If we don't get the funding and the supports that we need today, next year, the year after, hell, when I'm at the age where I need help, I'm just going to jump into a live volcano because there isn't going to be someone here for me. Thank you.
Sorry. We're good.
Yeah, good evening everyone. My name's Andrew McConville. I'm the Chief Executive for the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. But what we saw in this evening's budget was a very clear signal of the importance of the resources sector in helping to strengthen and reinvigorate Australia's economy, and within that the oil and gas sector. And as part of that, the Treasurer made very clear that Australia is on the journey to net zero emissions, and so initiatives to support the adoption of lower emissions technology, $300 million to develop low emissions LNG and hydrogen in Darwin, $247 million for the development of the hydrogen of origin scheme. These are really important initiatives to help Australia on that net zero journey. And then of course also there was significant acknowledgement of the cost of living pressures that Australia is facing, and so initiatives to support the development of new infrastructure to allow more supply onto the East Coast to help domestic manufacturing, to help domestic homes in meeting their energy needs. That $50 million will certainly help spark some of that innovation. And then of course, as we've seen, as energy costs have increased around the world, it's very important that our industry continues to make a contribution. And what we're seeing is over forward estimates, an increase of some $4 billion in petroleum resources rent tax, which will obviously be very important in terms of the government funding its initiatives for roads, schools, hospitals and the like. So what we need to see is continued innovation. We need to see continued investment, getting those investment settings right. We shouldn't leave ourselves under any misapprehension that Australia is in an absolute war for capital, and we want to see that capital invested here in Australia for Australian industry and Australian jobs. But we have to be competitive in doing that, so we have to make sure that we look at things like investment allowances and the incentives to make that capital want to come to Australia in order to grow the very significant resources in the oil and gas sector here in Australia. Any questions?
All
good. Thank you.
Hello, Freya Coles, spokesperson for the Australian Conservation Foundation. Right now, Australians are living through a climate and extinction crisis. And in tonight's federal budget, this federal government plans to decrease funding for climate action over the next 5 years. And that comes directly from tonight's figures. This federal government also plans to hand out billions of dollars to the fossil fuels industry, while hundreds of residents in northern New South Wales and Queensland have been told to leave their homes or are facing another flooding disaster. That is an extreme weather event exacerbated by human-induced climate change. Now, one of the worst subsidies in tonight's budget is the fuel tax credit scheme. Yep, Australians are going to receive a small temporary reprieve at the Bowser, but mining companies like BHP and Rio Tinto will get complete refunds on their diesel tax. Now, this is a subsidy that encourages pollution. It's going to increase to $7.7 billion next financial year, and then increase to more than $10 billion over the next 5 years. It just doesn't add up. And finally, this federal government's funding for nature and biodiversity does not weigh up to the crisis that's playing out in front of us. The koala, Australia's most loved, most iconic species, is almost at the brink of extinction across Queensland, New South Wales and the ACT. This budget allocates $50 million to koala recovery. But let's compare that to the $175 million this federal government has loaned the Olive Downs coal mine in Queensland, and also approved 5,000 hectares of known koala habitat destruction. It just doesn't add up. Now, the State of Environment report is now overdue. Minister Susan Lee is holding on to information that will spell out more bad news for the state of environment here in Australia. This federal budget doesn't live up to the challenges that we are all facing right now as a country. Any questions? Thank you.
Evening, David Pocock, Independent Senate candidate here in the ACT. How money is allocated in the budget should be what's good for the country, what's good for our future, and how are we building towards the future that Australians want. We've seen yet again Canberra miss out. We've got a We've seen yet again Canberra miss out. We've got a short-term cut to health funding. We're at the bottom of the pile once again when it comes to infrastructure. There was no mention of climate change or the smart energy transition that could actually save households money.
Annie Butler, Federal Secretary for the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation. Tonight, yet again, hundreds of thousands of nurses, midwives and care workers across the country have been let down by the Morrison government failing to do its job, failing to restore and rebuild our health and aged care systems so that every Australian has access to safe, decent care in their local area, and most importantly, that every older Australian is given the care with the dignity and respect that they deserve. Nurses who for more than 2 years have worked tirelessly at the very front lines of this pandemic, doing everything they can, working to protect Australians. Some of our members working 12 shifts in a row, multiple double shifts, working in layers of plastic and masks and all sorts of equipment, outdoors in the burning sun, in the thrashing rain, just to protect us, have been given nothing in return. No hope for the future. No hope for a decent framework that will build our health system back to what they need to support their work, so that there is no increase in a share of Commonwealth funding for our hospital systems. There is no reasonable support for nurses and midwives working out in the preventive and primary healthcare spaces. There's not even mention of nurse practitioners. More critically, aged care, unbelievably, has yet again been ignored. There are a few announcements around the edges, announcements for training places. What is the point of training more people to go into a sector in complete crisis until the core issues are fixed, as recommended by the Royal Commission now more than a year ago, and the actions still haven't been taken? Fix the staffing crisis, agree to commit and fund and increase aged care workers and nurses' wages, and guarantee absolute transparency over the use of taxpayers' funds across the aged care sector. As soon as we fix those problems, we'll start to fix aged care. This was just an election budget. We wait to hear what the parties are going to announce that they're going to commit to fully when the election is called. Thanks very much.
Ian Henschke, Chief Advocate, National Seniors Australia. This budget has delivered some relief, but not some reform. And what we wanted at National Seniors was to see the pension system changed so that pensioners who wanted to work could actually work and pay income tax rather than be losing their pension when they went out to work. We've got a labour shortage in Australia. Our policy was called Let the Pensioners Work. It was backed by businesses all over Australia. Mining companies, the Hotels Association, all sorts of people have said that they want this policy put in place. It was a missed opportunity tonight for the Morrison government to actually let pensioners work, be part of that labour force that's desperately needed in this country, and not penalise them and take money off their pensions when they do more than one day's work. We have to reform the pension system, and the idea of putting out a $250 bonus, if you like, for these people is a form of political football. I'm sure they will welcome this rise, but when you see rents rising by, say, $5 a week, in 1 year, that $250 will disappear. So it's critical that we look at pension reform in Australia. We need an independent tribunal to set the rate of the pension. We need to look at the fact that we've got 1 in 4 pensioners living in poverty, and this simple policy of allowing pensioners who fall under the income test to actually go out and work and earn some money without being penalised would have fixed not only that problem, but helped the budget fix its deficit. Because Deloitte Access Economics did a report 12 years ago which said that if you could increase worker participation rate by just 3% of the older Australians, it would add $36 billion to the GDP of the country. That was done by Chris Richardson. So we know that this economically stacks up, and we don't understand why the government didn't listen to us. On aged care, it's good to see that there has been some money put into aged care for traineeships. So we heard 15,000 traineeships are there, but we wanted mature age traineeships which would actually pay people while they were being trained. We need to make sure that when people are training, they get paid for it. There's a pilot program in South Australia that trains aged care workers and pays them while they're training. We suggested that that be rolled out across Australia. We need better trained workers, we need better paid workers in aged care, and that has to be fixed urgently. When Scott Morrison went and called the Royal Commission into aged care, which was more than 3 years ago, he said he was doing it to restore faith in the aged care system. I'm not sure that this budget has restored faith in the aged care system. It has to do a lot better in terms of aged care, and with the election coming up, seniors groups will be looking at what they're going to do about fixing pension poverty and improving aged care in Australia.
Hi everyone, Helen Dalley-Fisher from the Equality Rights Alliance. I'm the convener and we are one of the 6 national women's alliances. And I'm here tonight on an evening when it appears that 51% of the population just got forgotten. That's a lot of people to forget in a budget, but I'm talking about the women and girls of Australia. We've had a women's budget statement this year, which is the 2nd year in a row. We welcome that. However, there is real concern that the spend in that women's budget statement has dropped significantly, from 3.4 billion down to 2.1 billion, even though this budget is the one that includes the new extra funding for the National Plan on Violence Against Women and Their Children. That's a deep concern because that tells us that the funding for that plan is probably going to be inadequate, and it tells us that the rest of the funding across the women's budget statement has so far failed to meet expectations. What we're not seeing is the sort of structural change that we need to make a real difference in the lives of women. In particular, we're not seeing anything directed towards dealing with the pay discrepancies in feminised industries. We've heard a lot tonight about aged care. There's also all of the workers who are working in the NDIS system who are not seeing any sort of relief in relation to their lower wages. Teachers, nurses, other feminised industries are the sort that we need to be targeting with wage relief in order to make sure that the wage gap, which has been sitting stubbornly around 14% for quite some time, actually starts to shift. And that 14% is on base pay. It goes up to somewhere closer to 22% when we start looking at total earnings. A key part of that is we need to start paying attention to feminised industries, and there was nothing on that in the budget tonight. The other area of great concern is affordable housing. Nothing in the budget apart from a tried and failed attempt to stimulate first home buyer interest by supporting deposits. We know that this doesn't work. We know that what would work is the building of social housing. Waiting lists here in Canberra are currently sitting at 4 years for social housing, even for people who meet the very stringent criteria. We know that women who are over 50 and single are the fastest growing group of people who are facing homelessness in Australia. That's because of retirement incomes and the massive discrepancy we have as a result of that wage gap. It's also as a result of the issues that we have with paid parental leave and the fact that women take on the lion's share of caring for children and have gaps in their work life. As a result, we have women who are retiring with less income and are unable to compete in the housing market. But what do we see in this budget? Not only nothing for housing, but the paid parental leave change, which, while welcome, an opportunity to allow partners to split the leave between them, which is a good thing. It might help couples to redistribute the load a little bit, but there's nothing about superannuation on those payments. And that would have been one of the really useful things that got us to a point where women had workable retirement incomes. But instead, nothing on housing, nothing on paid parental leave with superannuation, nothing on the wage discrepancy around industries that are dominated by women. And that's a disappointment in this budget. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Alexi Boyd from the Council of Small Business Organisations Australia. I'm the CEO. Small business is quite pleased with this budget. It recognises the need for digitisation to be part of the growth of the economy and ensuring that small businesses, if they get their skates on, can actually identify with this need of having digital as part of their growth. The other thing that's really positive is extending the traineeships which happen for a number of sectors of the small business economy. It's not just about the tradies with their hats on, but actually there's a number of small businesses who can benefit from that. We're also quite pleased with the ability for small businesses to invest in training for their employees. Now we'd like to make sure that that's extended to sole traders as well, so that they're not left behind, and making sure that everyone can benefit from that. The importance of keeping small businesses part of the community is absolutely crucial at the moment when they are so vulnerable and they really need the opportunity to grow and thrive. So what COSBOA is asking for is making sure that the reforms, the changes, the deregulation that we've seen the government do so efficiently in the last couple of years continues, and we continue to see giving that time back to small businesses that they've lost as a result of COVID. It's really important that we look after small businesses so they can continue to look after their communities, look after their employees, their workforce, and themselves to keep the economy thriving. Thank you. Any questions?
Do you share the concerns of a lot of the NGOs here that the cost of living measures are one-off? Like, are people going to have the confidence to go out and spend if so many of those measures are one-offs?
Look, any one-off measures, as we've seen in the past, when we inject money into the economy, it often gets spent with small businesses, and that's really pleasing to see. Obviously, the one-offs also help small businesses to make sure that they've got more money that can be put back into the business. But when we see the cost of running a business, such as the supply chain issues, the costs going up, wages potentially going up, and inputs like fuel, meaning that almost every good and service out there has to be increased, then it is concerning. And we do need to see those short, sharp hits to the economy to make sure that small businesses can benefit by having more money and cash flow through the economy. Any other questions this morning? Thank you.
Hi everybody, Trent Toomey, National President of the Pharmacy Guild of Australia. And you know, I stand here tonight on behalf of every local community pharmacy who I just have to say is not only a little disappointed but a little heartbroken. And you know, tweaking around with the medicine safety net, which means people can get help at the end of October instead of the end of November, doesn't help people who are living paycheck to paycheck in March. We're supposed to have a universal healthcare system in Australia, public hospitals, access to bulk billing doctors, access to affordable medicines, and the fact that the government has acknowledged that medicines aren't affordable by tweaking with the safety net doesn't actually address the problem that people need help paycheck to paycheck, week to week, at the beginning of the year. And you know, we would like to see the government have another look between now and whenever the election is in May about ways in which they can articulate a proper vision for our healthcare system, a vision for our healthcare system beyond rats, beyond vaccines. What do the government, what do the opposition in that, for that matter, expect Australians to be able to receive from their healthcare system, no matter what postcode they live in? And if we keep going down the track we're going down, we're going to end up with a healthcare system that's more like what we see in the United States than what we've grown up with in here in Australia. So, you know, we're just, I have to say, a little disappointed on behalf of the 24% of Australians that have had to delay, defer, or go without getting medication for their diabetes, medication for their asthma, medication, you know, to help ensure that they don't have a stroke. And this is the best bang for buck a government can spend to keep people from ramping in our hospitals.
Are you worried that it often gets left out of the conversation? We hear about inflation, rising cost of living, rent, groceries, petrol. People don't often think about the fact that some people do skip getting medication because the cost is too much. Is that something that you're worried that, you know, goes by the wayside or gets overlooked?
Your local community pharmacist is really worried about that. I mean, the government's own statisticians, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, have said 900,000 Australians in the 2020-21 year delayed, deferred, or went without getting their medicines. And, you know, giving a couple of $100 as a bit of a sweetener, you know, sometime between now and Easter might be great to help you buy an extra couple of Easter eggs, but it's not going to help you balance the budget, and it's not going, you know, to help you afford both your milk and your broccoli, as well as your insulin and your puffer. Thanks, everyone.
G'day, Mark Purcell, CEO from the Australian Council for International Development. Australia is facing a very, very complex geostrategic region. We've got increased competition, particularly in the Pacific, from China. And in Southeast Asia, we've got combined our second largest trading partners in the ASEAN countries, and our economic recovery is tied up with their recovery. So how we partner with them and how we assist them with our development assistance really, really matters. The Australian government has increased its aid program to our neighbours tonight, and we really, really welcome that. It's much needed because of the complex geostrategic environment that we face now and into the future. So the base budget has gone up, is $4 billion according to the government, and they've put about another 400 million in over a couple of financial years. And particularly important is about 280 million that is going to Pacific countries for economic recovery and also for dealing with COVID. So there's going to be fiscal assistance for budgets in small island states. There's also going to be assistance for connectivity, so this is more deep sea cables between Australia and between Pacific Island countries, and this is really, really needed and very, very welcome. Also, in a non-grant measure, the government has increased our lending capacity to the Pacific through an infrastructure facility from 1.5 billion to 3 billion. So what that means is we'll be able to get in and lend more to Pacific Island states. Now that is a problem for many of those countries because they have tiny economies and their ability to repay Australia is not great at all, and it's going to be at the expense of health and education budgets. So we think that the government should be having a moratorium on debt repayments for any lending it does into the Pacific. But also importantly, I think the government is doing the right thing in directing 1.8 billion of our aid program overall to the Pacific. However, this concept of temporary targeted measures that they keep talking about, and a base of 4 billion that's 15 years old when John Howard left government, that's not serving Australia's national interests well now. We really need to bring these temporary measures and say, these measures are one program, there is no base. The base is 4.5 billion and we're going to grow it from there because we need to do that for the geostrategic circumstances we're in. Our economic recovery is tied up with our neighbours' economic recovery. Our stability is tied up with our neighbours' stability in the region. And so the more that we invest on a permanent basis, not a temporary basis, the better it will be for all Australians.
Labor has said that it might increase foreign aid when it's in government, but it's unlikely to be making any promises in its budget reply on Thursday. Are you disappointed that increasing ambition on foreign aid isn't playing more of a part on this side of the election?
Well, I think the government is starting to put more money. We've seen an increase in 2020 in the government's assistance, 1.3 billion, and then we've seen an increase in this budget, not as large, but still definitely an increase of 280 million into the Pacific. So even if it's not featuring prominently, the dollars are telling the story that we're going to need, we are responding, we're going to keep needing to respond, both because the economic decline in our region is going to affect Australia. Also, the pandemic is still ongoing in many countries that are our neighbours, and so that can affect Australia with variants of COVID taking root and coming to our shores very quickly. So I'd expect that we're still going to see this play out over the coming years. I don't think the aid program is going to decrease, and I think it's going to need to be a permanent, steady series of increasing measures to deal with the new realities, the very, very fraught realities that Australia is finding itself in this part of the world. Thank you.
Good evening, Melissa Donnelly, National Secretary of the Community and Public Sector Union. We represent federal public sector workers. The Morrison government will call a federal election, locking in 9 years of funding and staffing cuts to key public sector agencies. This represents 8,200 fewer APS employees doing the job they do to serve the Australian community. And tonight we found out that the Morrison government will go even further, cutting over 2,700 jobs from Centrelink. This represents 9.4% of its workforce. At a time when so many Australians and their families are still in need of help. On a night where rain continues to fall in flood-affected areas, the Morrison government is effectively turning their back on those Australians who still need help and cutting the jobs of the people trying to provide that help. This will mean that it takes longer for the phone calls to be answered and claims to be processed. And the much promised relief for veterans and their families was not delivered in this budget. This budget only guarantees a fraction of what is required to deal with the complex and significant backlog in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and fails to provide the support needed for Australian vets and their families. To be clear, last year the department got 440 new jobs, but the backlog increased by 10,000 to 65,000. What we've seen tonight is not even going to move the dial. It's not going to make a dent on the backlog. It's not good enough for Australian veterans and their families, and it's not what they deserve. The Morrison government should do much more to support Australian veterans and their families.
So do we need a commitment from both major parties heading into the election to greatly increase that funding and those staffing levels if we're going to ever get through this backlog?
We know that the backlog is increasing, and we know that the proportion of complicated claims is increasing. So we want to see government do far more to deliver for Australian veterans and their families. And what is required is really significant, but it's what Australian vets and their families deserve. After the much talk on the weekend from Minister G and today in Parliament, it is a bit disappointing that there is only a fraction of guaranteed funding, and it is insufficient to deal with the backlog that the department is facing.
If it's not, given that it's only that initial funding that's actually in the budget, can that other pledge for the longer term actually be believed? Like, you know, is it only counts when it's actually in the budget process, right?
Look, I think for our members working in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and for so many in the Australian community, you only believe the Morrison government when it actually delivers. And for veterans and their families and dealing with this backlog, tonight it has not delivered. Finally, for a budget that was talked much about cost of living pressures, the government has failed to do the very simple thing it could have and delivered a real wage increase for its own workforce. With the stroke of a pen, the Morrison government could have delivered real wage increases and increased job security for its own workers. But once again, there's a lot of talk and not much follow through, and the Morrison government has failed to deliver. Thank you.
Sorry, can we just hold on one sec?
Just change batteries, just 1 second. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Marie McCabe, CEO of Dementia Australia. Great to see increased funding for aged care, but imperative that what we see is increased funding specifically for dementia, for the aged care workforce to upgrade their skill and capacity to care for the more than 70% of people living with dementia in residential aged care. And really important, we will continue to work with both sides of government to ensure that we fulfil on the recommendations of the Royal Commission. Thank you.
Looks like it.
There's no way.
Glad you
That's
got
half
that.
the amount of last year.
Glad you got that.